Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to the last session of India by the Bay, Hong Kong, in association with Asia Society, Hong Kong. I do hope you've enjoyed all of the previous sessions on yoga, food, and music. And if you haven't, you can still view them on India by the Bay or Asia Society, Hong Kong, or Teamwork Arts Facebook page or YouTube. And now for our closing, most anticipated session of the series is Churchill, hero or anti-hero, with Shashi Tharoor in conversation with Mukulika Banerjee on the life and legacy of Winston Churchill, one of history's most complex figures. Dr. Shashi Tharoor is an author, politician, and former international civil servant. Dr. Tharoor straddles several worlds of experience. He is currently a third-term Lok Sabha Member of Parliament representing the Thiruvananthapuram constituency, which he once again won with record margin. He's previously served as the Minister of State for Human Resource Development and the Minister of State for External Affairs in the Government of India. He currently chairs the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Information and Technology. Welcome on board, Dr. Tharoor. I wish we could have taken you to Hong Kong and really taken you to some of those most magnificent restaurants that they have there, or perhaps on another occasion. A happier time post-COVID. Promise. Dr. Mukulika Banerjee is a social anthropologist and professor at the London School of Economics and the inaugural director of the South Asia Centre from 2015 to 2020. Her books include The Pathan Unarmed, The Sari, Why India Votes, and The Forthcoming Democracy. Mukulika Banerjee, Shashi Tharoor, over to you both.
Thank you very much, Sanjoy. Now, Shashi Tharoor has written, debated about Churchill on many an occasion, indeed as part of JLF festivals in various parts of the world. And today it's a great pleasure to be able to do this with him in Hong Kong at a festival for Hong Kong. Now, Churchill is remembered for a variety of reasons. We are assessing his life and legacy for a number of different reasons. Most recently, in London, the capital of the country of which he served as Prime Minister, in June this year, in 2020, as part of global Black Lives Matter protests across the world, there were a series of protests around Winston Churchill's statue in Westminster, in the square that outside the Houses of Parliament, where his tall, glowering figure has stood for many a decade. And protesters felt that his statue must be pulled down. The police had to then cover him and protect him with a barricade from future protest and to stop it being toppled. So Churchill is not simply a hero, a relic of the 20th century. He's very much part of contemporary conversations and comes up in a variety of ways in today's politics. Of course, this is also the time when decolonization is sweeping through campuses across Euro-America and in very different ways in Asia and Africa in university campuses, where students and academics are seriously reconsidering the way knowledge is being produced about heroes, about victims, about the victors. And so thinking about Churchill in the context of these talks of decolonization, of really thinking about critiquing the British Empire, has become so important. And in British politics today, post-Brexit, where Britain is refashioning herself as global Britain in a completely, and trying to establish new relationships with all parts of the world, Churchill is frequently evoked as the hero whom the current Prime Minister of Britain fashions himself on and is admired widely across the Conservative Party, of which he was a member. Of course, he's also remembered as a writer and a winner of the Nobel Prize. And most of all, and I think this is where, Shashi, there is a bizarre overlap between your career and Winston Churchill's of being both a writer and a politician. Of course, Churchill was an MP for 64 years, barring a couple in the middle. We wish you many long, happy years of being an MP, just like Churchill, even though I know he's not your hero. So Churchill has these different aspects, and what Shashi and I thought we would do today is pick up on some of these aspects of Churchill's life and really assess that legacy and think about it. But the first thing, I mean, there are a couple of ways in which I think we should also recognize, given this is India by the Bay Festival at Hong Kong, that Churchill's own career at least a couple of points very significantly intersected with the fate of Hong Kong. And the very first one in 1931, Shashi, you'll remember, was when Japan invaded northeastern China. It was, Hong Kong looked very precarious, very vulnerable, and there was talk of the need for reinforcements for the defense of Hong Kong. And Churchill at that point quite unilaterally said, no, there was no need for it. He made a sort of fairly typically bombastic speech saying, this is all wrong. If Japan goes to war, there is not the slightest chance of holding Hong Kong or relieving it. It is most unwise to increase the loss we should suffer there. Instead of increasing the garrison, it ought to be reduced to a symbolic scale. Japan will think twice before declaring war on the British Empire, and whether there are 2 or 6 battalions in Hong Kong will make no difference to her choice. I wish we had fewer troops there, but to move any would be noticeable and dangerous. And happily for Hong Kong, his cabinet intervened and said this might not be the best idea. And it was actually strategically very important to defend Hong Kong, and the Canadian Prime Minister, Mackenzie King, then answered his plea for help and immediately sent 2 battalions to Hong Kong. So this very early, this is 1931, long before the Second World War, for which, of course, Churchill is remembered and celebrated as a defender of liberal democracy against fascism. Long before, in 1931, he wasn't the most astute of strategists, was he?
Not at all, Mukulika. Well, you actually said a lot of things to react to, if I may. First, of course, and perhaps gratuitously, was this business about Boris Johnson evoking him. I think there was this wonderful Marx phrase, right, that all great world historic facts and personages appear twice, the first time as tragedy and the second time as farce. I think that really would have to be Winston Churchill was a tragedy for all of the subject peoples he oppressed, and Boris Johnson seems to be a farce with his attempts to model himself. This is implied comparison with Churchill, but be that as it may, I'm not going to get into British politics now. On the question of the defense of Hong Kong that you mentioned, you're quite right. Churchill wasn't very keen, but it's of a piece with his overall track record of disastrous judgment on military matters. We have to go back to the horrendous defeat at Gallipoli in 1915, a plan that he had hatched when First Lord of the Admiralty. Then again, when he became Prime Minister, the Norway disaster of 1914 was his baby. His decision to delay the planned 1943 invasion of Europe in favor of a pointless diversionary campaign in North Africa instead in 1942, which in turn led inevitably to the great Allied losses in Italy, because their topography overwhelmingly favored the defenders. And all of this, suggests that as a military strategist, Churchill was often in error but never in doubt. There was a sort of bloodthirstiness to his rhetoric, which was excessive as his rhetoric was. But then you talked about Churchill as a great defender of liberal democracy, and I have to say I must dissent completely from that. Because it's too easy to forget that throughout the 1920s and early 1930s, Churchill was an open admirer of Mussolini. He declared in the 1920s that the Italian fascist movement had rendered a service to the whole world. Had it been necessary, he stated, he was prepared to do in Britain what Mussolini had done in Italy, and I quote, from Churchill. If I had been an Italian, I'm sure that I would have been wholeheartedly with you from the start to finish in your triumphant struggle. He traveled to Rome in 1927 to express his admiration for fascism. And there he announced that he could not help being charmed, again Churchill's words, by Mussolini's gentle and simple bearing and by his calm, detached poise. This is all, by the way, I checked these quotes from the Times of London in 1927, so I'm not talking about any retrospective. This is stuff that Churchill actually said. He was an open admirer of fascism and dictatorship, and as for democracy, a very late convert to the cause. As late as 1931, Mukulika, he sneered notoriously at the Indian representative to the Round Table Conference. And he said, the Indian Congress and other elements in this agitation for freedom is my edition, represent neither the numbers, the strength, nor the virtues of the Indian people. They merely represent, let me quote again, those Indians who've acquired a veneer of Western civilization and have read all those books about democracy, which Europe is now beginning increasingly to discard, unquote. In other words, democracy to Churchill was an idea that Europeans like him were happy to discard in the heyday of fascism. When circumstances plunged him into being the standard bearer of democracy and freedom, he embraced the public relations opportunity. But the idea that he always stood for liberal democracy and freedom and all that's good in the West and so on, as people like to think, reflects neither the man's professed convictions nor his record. He was an awful figure. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, a man, in fact, there was a very famous comment about Churchill when he first got into politics. When Charles Hobhouse, who was the Postmaster General, the cabinet position in those days during the First World War, described Churchill as ill-mannered, boastful, unprincipled, and without any redeeming features. And Hobhouse was right in 1915, and it continued to be true until, of course, the world and historical judgments were swayed by his hypocritical and fraudulent rhetoric. This is, frankly, a fanatical advocate of anything but democracy. He preached the oppression of non-white peoples, and we can talk in greater detail. I mean, his advocacy of poison gas against uncivilized people like you and me. This is not a good human being. This is a really evil man. There's very little to choose between him before luck turned his way and he became Prime Minister of wartime Britain, and the Churchill that the world knew in the 10s, 20s, 30s, whose record is absolutely disgraceful.
So, I mean, if one thinks about Churchill in contemporary Britain, say, there is a huge defense and genuine admiration for the man. Right? There are people who will argue till the cows come home with you, say, about why Churchill is a hero. So if you were to play devil's advocate yourself, what would you say in his defense? Or do you think he's indefensible throughout?
No, I mean, I'll tell you what I think this claim rests. I remember Harold Evans writing some years ago about Churchill as the British Lionheart on the ramparts of Western civilization. I mean, this rests almost entirely on a stirring rhetoric during World War II. And I think that ever since World War II, which his side won, books and cinema have assiduously built up the image of Churchill, the defiant bulldog who kept the British in the Second World War, when so many of the establishment, like Chamberlain, wanted peace. And of course, embellished by Churchill, the parliamentarian of rapier wit, who dominated its politics at a time when Britain was the epicenter of a worldwide empire. So all of these things made him a very attractive figure to glamorize. But even then, most of those who attempt to glamorize him have to invent fake stories about him, because the few good stories aren't enough. So this entire thing about that Oscar-winning Churchill film in 2018, which shows him having a conversation with a black man on the subway, I mean, this is preposterous. He would never have treated a black man as anything but subhuman, as he treated Indians as subhumans. And then, of course, he was an elegant writer. I think it was said that one of his critics, John Maynard Keynes, said he was the finest finest writer amongst politicians since Disraeli. And that may well be true, but the vaingloriously self-serving but elegant volumes that he authored on the Second World War that won him the Nobel Prize for literature, since even the Nobel Committee in all conscience couldn't give an award for peace, were actually an unwitting tribute to the fictional qualities inherent in his self-justifying embellishments. It was literature in the sense of fiction. This is not a man he said it bluntly. He said, look, history is going to be kind to me because I will write it. History will judge me kindly, he said, because I intend to write it myself. And he was quite open. He said, words are the only things that last forever. I can do what I like, but as long as I craft the right words, those will shape my image. And he turned out to be totally correct. But I think those of us who are willing to look beyond the word. One of his admirers and allies, the Australian Prime Minister, Sir Robert Menzies, remarked to Churchill during the Second World War, when his rhetoric was at its peak, his real tyrant is the glittering phrase, so attractive to his mind that awkward facts have to give way. That's it. And the awkward facts about Churchill are what I tend to focus on. They go back before his disgraceful record as an imperialist and a racist, and let me use the actual words that people shirk too often from using about him, a disgraceful racist, but somebody who, for example, as Home Secretary in 1910, he sent battalions of police from London to attack striking miners in Tony Pandy in South Wales. And he even held troops in reserve in Cardiff in case the police were inadequate, essentially acting in the interests of the employers rather than the miners, right? Which is why in many parts of Wales, Tony Pandy is still a curse. This is a man who was prepared to kill in the interests of employers and to mobilize the full force of the British state. He enjoyed personally directing military repression. Again, as Home Secretary, he went off and took operational command of the police during a siege of Latvian anarchists in Stepney. And he took the decision to burn them to death in the house where they were trapped. And that was Churchill, an absolutely bloodthirsty people. And he said, for example, that he was quite happy, he had no scruples about ordering the killings of people he considered lesser breeds, quote unquote. And I'll give you another Churchill quote, I've got a collection of them. I do not admit that a great wrong has been done to the Red Indians of America or the black people of Australia, but the fact that a stronger race, a higher grade race, has come in and taken its place. That was Churchill. And for that matter, the Irish didn't particularly appeal to him as worthy either, because during the fight for Irish independence in 1918 to 23, he was one of the very few British officials in favor of bombing the Irish protesters from the air. And he called for airplanes to use machine gun firebombs on the Irish. This kind of bloodthirsty, enthusiastic advocacy of military intervention marked him throughout. Russian Revolution, he wanted to do it. He pioneered the use of poison gas against the Bolsheviks. He urged the same in Iraq. As Secretary of State for the Colonies in 1921, he said, I'm strongly in favor of using poison gas against the uncivilized tribes. It would spread a lively terror. This is the man. Forgive me, when I hear the British getting all misty-eyed about him as some sort of paragon of freedom and democracy, this is an evil monster. This is no advocate of freedom and democracy. His own record is there if only people would look beyond the rhetoric.
It is very interesting that there is this lingering and very robust admiration for Churchill. In a sense, his winning the war has overshadowed a lot of the detail that, some of it, which you're presenting here, is simply not circulated in public conversations. Here, of course, I will not talk that. But I want to go back to something that you were saying a little bit earlier about his fascination for Mussolini, right? And his flirtation with fascism, his complete disregard, his lack of attachment to democratic ideas.
Right.
This was the man who is remembered to have stood up to Hitler. So where is his position on fascism, number one? How would you see that distinction between Mussolini and Hitler, if you see one? And secondly, I think we should spend a bit longer talking about race, much more squarely in a minute. Yeah.
Sure. Well, on fascism, I gave you chapter and verse of all that he said, but it's worse because in 1931, as a backbencher, he was consorting openly with the likes of the British fascist leader, Sir Oswald Mosley. And in fact, it's no accident that as late as 37, 38, some prominent Germans were writing that he would be a very suitable candidate to head a pro-Nazi Vichy-style government in Britain. What happened was that he didn't like Chamberlain. There was a conflict going on. I've forgotten which historian it was who observed that had Churchill died in 1938, he would only be remembered as a failure. He'd been a backbencher throughout the 30s, and everything he said would have obviously been discredited by having to fight the Nazis and the fascists thereafter. But I think Churchill, to some degree, lucked out. A man who really had a lot of contempt for democracy, took a strong dislike to Nazism when it moved into Czechoslovakia, when it moved into Austria, and I think particularly to Chamberlain, because Chamberlain's rather weak-kneed response, as Churchill saw it, gave Churchill an opportunity to stand up for the kind of robust, muscular approach that he had always advocated against all sorts of sundry targets, usually lesser breeds and natives and people like that. But here he was willing to advocate it against the Nazis. And I think, when Halifax was offered the prime ministership, but it wasn't possible for him to accept because he was a member of the House of Lords, Churchill lucked out. And when Churchill got it, then of course he took over. He talked about this being what he had been destined for. This was the destiny that he was now there. And it was like an actor inhabiting a role. He recited the lines appropriate for the role. There were no genuine democratic convictions there. These were the words that appealed to him, and he was brilliant with words. Let's not doubt that. I think even admirers like the historian John Charnley talked about the sublime nonsense that he spoke. Blood, toil, tears, and sweat. We shall fight them on the beaches. We shall fight them on the landing grounds. We shall fight them on the fields and in the streets. I mean, this was sublime nonsense, but it really managed to stir the passions of an entire nation, and good, that was his great achievement. But you mentioned race, and obviously people tend to think that it's because of his treatment or mistreatment and contempt for India and Indians that I have so much of dislike of Churchill. But in fact, he actually supported the pseudoscience of eugenics. In the first quarter of the 20th century, Churchill was hugely in favor of eugenic science, which was essentially the pseudoscience that underlay a lot of Nazi convictions. He openly mused about the idea of sterilizing the unfit. He also, of course, professed scorn for women's rights. He opposed suffragettes. He opposed the vote for women. All that has been consistent throughout Churchill's career from the 1890s onwards was the pursuit of personal glory and self-promotion. The British Empire provided him an ideal platform for that. It was an irresistible opportunity for his personal self-advancement, his self-glorification. And even during the Second World War, when he was allegedly this figure of democracy, some of the nasty old Churchill came through. He declared himself, for example, in favor of the terror bombing of civilians. He wrote that he wanted absolutely devastating, exterminating attacks by heavy bombers, very heavy bombers, in his words. Now, he didn't give the order to firebomb Dresden, but the policy that made something like the horror of Slaughterhouse 5 possible came from Churchill. He openly recommended using chemical warfare against civilians in Germany. He said, I'd be prepared to do anything that should hit the enemy in a murderous place. And he said, he asked a political ally for support in using poison gas. We could drench the cities of the Ruhr and many other cities in Germany, he said. He came up with a plan to feed German cattle with anthrax cakes. But this would kill the cattle and thereby deprive the Germans of milk and beef. But of course, would also kill German civilians who would be eating the infected cows. And amorality never troubled Churchill. And this amorality, I mean, even the right wing has problems with him about things like the involuntary repatriation of 2 million people to the Soviet Union, many of whom had never been Soviet citizens. Solzhenitsyn, for example, was anti-Churchill for turning over Soviet civilians to communist rule, for turning over the Soviet command of the Cossack Corps of 90,000 men to the communists, wagon loads of old people, women and children. You can read the Gulag Archipelago for that. The brutal expulsion of Germans. Now, I'm not, a great fan of the Nazi campaign of expansion into Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Hungary, Romania, and so on. But Churchill was equally brutal in expelling these innocent civilians out. There was great suffering, and it's been estimated that about 2.1 million civilians died from the Churchill-ordered expulsion of Germans from these countries when they were conquered by the Allies. Churchill told the House of Commons, expulsion of people is the method which will be the most satisfactory and lasting. There'll be no mixture of populations to cause endless trouble. We'll make a clean sweep. I'm not alarmed by doing this to people. So, he was, really an amoral figure. He never had many scruples. I know that one doesn't like discussing personal matters when you're discussing the politics of somebody, but that it has been suggested that while his son Randolph was away at the front, he actually got his daughter-in-law Pamela to intimately entertain the American envoy Averell Harriman, whom she later married. That's another story. But he was, in other words, untroubled by effectively condoning, if not inciting, his own son's cuckolding in what he saw as the larger interest of developing closer relations with the U.S. It's just an altogether dislikable person. And then, of course, the racism, coming right around to that again. Racism about Africans, racism about Indians, racism about poor Afghans, racism in Kenya, and that's much later, when he was Prime Minister the second time around. He was elected in, 55, I guess it was. 51.
51 to 55.
51 to 55. 55 is when he stepped down for Harold Macmillan. And 51 to 55 is when his repression in Kenya was at its peak, involving the forced relocation of local people from the fertile highlands to make way for white colonial settlers, forcing of men, women, and children to concentration camps where rape, castration, cigarettes lit on tender spots, and electric shock treatment were all used by the British under Churchill's rule. I don't know how many of your audience will remember the great actor Richard Burton, but Burton was once cast as Churchill in a television drama, and because he was such a thorough actor, he researched and read up Churchill to get into the skin of the character. And he wrote an op-ed in the New York Times that nearly destroyed his acting career, because he said, in the course of preparing myself, I realized afresh how much I hate Churchill. I hate him virulently, stalking down the corridors of endless power all through history. What man of sanity, Burton wrote, would say, hearing of the atrocities committed by the Japanese, we shall wipe them out, every one of them, men, women, children. There shall not be a Japanese left on the face of the earth. That's Churchill's words. And Richard Burton said, such simple-minded cravings for revenge leave me with a horrified but reluctant awe for Churchill's single-minded and merciless ferocity. So, of course, Burton was vilified in Britain for his honesty. He was banned from the BBC. But this egregious fondness for slaughter in the name of imperial glory is what marks Churchill out as another version of Stalin or Mao or Pol Pot. No better, just an absolutely horrendous human being.
And this, and part of, I mentioned decolonization at the start of our conversation, and one of the themes that has emerged very strongly, and it has had to emerge because it has been subdued and suppressed for so long in, say, the teaching of history in schools in Britain, where the history of the empire is simply not taught as part of British history, that the sheer violence and the racial injustice, the feelings of superiority that underlay the colonial project. It wasn't an add-on. It wasn't some individuals who believed in it and therefore had to be. This was the basic logic on which it was founded, and very importantly, that this had real implications for how capitalism grew and how trade grew, and that these inequalities of race and superiorities or assumptions of superiority absolutely underpinned this ideology of colonial expansion. Now, I wanted to connect with Hong Kong. The second thing worth remembering is a conversation recently remembered in a newspaper article was the conversation that Roosevelt had with Churchill at the end of the Second World War. Right? And so this is long before the 50s in Kenya and the end of the empire there and the cost that it brought. So Roosevelt was trying to pressure Churchill to return Hong Kong to China as a concession for its support in the war. But this is an account by Roosevelt's son who wrote in his book, As He Saw It, father started it. Of course, he remarked with a sly sort of assurance, of course, after the war, one of the preconditions of any lasting peace will have to be greatest possible freedom of trade. Right? You need freedom of trade for lasting peace. And Roosevelt's son says he paused. The Prime Minister's head, Churchill's head, was lowered. He was watching father steadily from under one eyebrow. No artificial barriers, Roosevelt pursued. As few favored economic agreements as possible. Opportunities for expansion. Markets open for healthy competition. Churchill shifted in his armchair. The British Empire trade agreements, he began heavily, but father broke in. Yes, those empire trade agreements are a case in point. It's because of them that the people of India and Africa, of all the colonial Near East and the Far East, are still as backward as they are. And then he goes on to detail how Churchill's anger bubbled over. He added, Churchill's neck reddened and he crouched forward. Mr. President, England does not propose for a moment to lose its favored position among the British dominions. The trade that has made England great shall continue, and under conditions prescribed by England's ministers. You see, Roosevelt said slowly, it is along in here somewhere that there is likely to be some disagreement between you, Winston, and me. I'm firmly of the belief that if we are to arrive at a stable peace, it must involve the development of backward countries, backward peoples. How can this be done? It can't be done, obviously, by 18th century methods. And while everybody in the room was breathlessly watching this exchange, Churchill himself was beginning to look quite apoplectic. And then his furious rage just unleashed. He said there can be no tampering with the empire's economic agreements. They are the foundation of our greatness. Churchill told him to his face, Hong Kong will be eliminated from the British Empire only over my dead body, and called the proposal, the American China policy, a great American illusion.
Well, you know it.
Yeah, no, I'm saying that it's worth remembering this for what is happening in Hong Kong today.
That's right.
Curious, sort of almost altered balance between Britain and the US as it was in the 40s and now, but also to call attention really to this idea of the terms of trade that Britain has always traded on.
But you know, this has also got a parallel to the one subject we haven't talked about, which is India, and I think we should come to that since this is an Indian literary festival, because Roosevelt also urged Churchill to grant India its freedom or at least dominion status, and Churchill said no. And you know, his no was based on his inveterate imperialism and at the same time his racism. And he called Indians a beastly people with a beastly religion. And he told Roosevelt that the principles of the Atlantic Charter, you remember when Britain was going cap in hand to America to get loans and lend lease and all of that stuff, Roosevelt said, look, you know, we have to declare certain principles on the basis of which we're doing, you know, you're standing up for democracy and freedom and liberation and self-determination and so on. And Churchill said, no, the principles of the Charter cannot apply to India because frankly, his notions of freedom and democracy faltered at the frontiers of empire. And as a racialist, he couldn't himself see people of color as entitled to the same rights as himself. For example, his bitterness towards Mahatma Gandhi was absolutely beyond any reasonable capacity. A man who was being admired at the same time by so many people in the democratic world. He said Gandhi and all he stands for will sooner or later have to be grappled with and finally crushed. He said, I want the Mahatma to be tied to the ground and trampled upon by elephants. In fact, some of his remarks were so blood-curdling that his own Secretary of State for War, Leopold Emery, confessed that he could see very little difference between Churchill's attitude and Hitler's. That's something that the Brits don't like to admit. His wartime philosophy, exterminate the Japanese, bomb the Germans into the ground, starve the Indians to death. I mean, this was Churchill. This is not exactly, certainly if Britain had lost the war, this is a man who would have deservedly been hanged as a war criminal. We all know that some 4 million Bengalis died of hunger in the 1943 famine, but how much of what happened to them was dictated by decisions personally taken by Churchill has been very effectively researched by Madhuri Mukherjee in Churchill's Secret War, in which he demonstrates he deliberately ordered the diversion of food from starving Indian civilians to well-supplied British soldiers, and that too to top up European stockpiles for a possible future invasion of Greece and Yugoslavia. And we're asked to justify his policy. So the starvation of anyway underfed Bengalis, like you, Mukulika, you're an underfed Bengali. The starvation of anyway underfed Bengalis is less serious than that of sturdy Greeks. I mean, that was it. So he actually got the Brits to take grain out of starving Bengal for home consumption in Britain, generous buffer stocks in Europe, grain for the tummies and so on. The life or death of the Indian subjects of the British Empire was irrelevant. And Churchill said the famine was Indians' own fault for breeding like rabbits. So India's food grains were exported to Ceylon. Australian wheat was sent sailing past Calcutta with the bodies of those who had died of starvation littered the streets to these storage depots in the Mediterranean to create stockpiles, not even for immediate consumption by hungry people. And India was not permitted to spend its own sterling reserves, even use its own ships to import food. And the British government's purchasing of supplies for its troops elsewhere meant that the Indian open market became unaffordable for ordinary Indians. And when officers of conscience pointed out in a telegram to the Prime Minister the scale of the tragedy caused by his decisions, Churchill's only reaction was to peevishly ask, why hasn't Gandhi died yet? Now that's the man. I know the Churchill apologists like to say that these were all difficult wartime decisions. You can't look with retrospect about this. He's not like Hitler or Stalin because they deliberately wanted to kill. Well, let me turn to a Brit, Adam Jones, the editor of the Journal of Genocide Research, who called Churchill a genuine genocidaire because he saw Indians as a foul race. He wanted them eliminated. He didn't care if they died of starvation. And he urged the British Air Force chief to send some of his surplus bombers to destroy the Indians. That's Churchill. So I would say, and I know we've come to the end of our time, but that the hagiology of this odious man obliges us to remind people of his crimes. To the Iraqis whom Churchill gassed, the Greek protesters in the streets of Athens who were mowed down on his orders in 1944, to sundry Pashtuns, the poor Afghans whom he was only too happy to exterminate and of whom he spoke with contempt. He said the Pashtuns needed to recognize the superiority of race and that any Pashtun who resists the British should be killed without quarter. To people like the Kenyans we've talked about, the Welsh miners we talked about, as well as to Indians like you and me. It will always be a mystery why a few bombastic speeches have been enough to wash the bloodstains of Churchill's racist hands. If I had to express an epitaph for Churchill, he's a war criminal, an enemy of decency and humanity, a blinkered imperialist untroubled by the oppression of non-white peoples, and a man who fought to deny us freedom, fortunately unsuccessfully.
Shashi, what worries me, you say it's a mystery why he's remembered, right?
Well, I answered earlier why I thought he'd been praised when you asked me.
What I think in the contemporary climate, I know you said you didn't want to talk about British politics, but actually looking at the world now, and certainly sitting in London as I am, the reason and the very fact that Churchill is celebrated is not simply a misunderstanding or a misreading or being an apologist for some stray remarks that he made in an absent-minded manner or making racist jokes to irritate his friend, the kind of things that we have heard in defense of Churchill. But the fact that he is celebrated tells us something about the nature of British politics today, would you say? I mean, this is Britain today is in a very different place than it was before it had the referendum to decide whether they stay or not in the EU. And it's got to, again, once more, forge bilateral relations with countries across the globe. Celebrating Churchill and his ideas is not going to cannot set the tone for 21st century politics, or can it?
No, but in some ways what's interesting is that for the first time it's been challenged. I mean, at the time that Churchill left the prime ministership, at the time that he died, and for decades afterwards, it would be unthinkable to even remind people of the painful facts that I have recited for you today.
Yes.
I remember once trying in the 1990s at a dinner table in Sweden with a left-wing British journalist. He got up, he was so offended, and said, how would you like it if I spoke like this of your Mahatma Gandhi? And this was something that totally stunned me, because I couldn't imagine anyone, equating the two. But that was the kind of way in which British people thought he was beyond the pale. But I would say, and this is my hopeful note, that I think Britain is slightly changing. Many have forgotten that at the May Day protests of 2000, protesters spray-painted red blood around Churchill's mouth and gave him a mohawk haircut, transforming this iconic war hero into the comic book supervillain, the Joker. I think it's been an updated contemporary reimagining of all the evil this man represented around the world. There would never have been any question of needing to protect Churchill's statue before, but now there is, because in fact Churchill's statue is or was deemed to be under threat from the protesters. So people are waking up. This entire controversy about statues of Clive, statues of Churchill, and so on, reflect the fact that statues are erected to reflect the times of their erection, not the times that we live in today. And that today's people have every right to set the record straight with our own sensibilities. I have no doubt that the man who was voted in some ridiculous poll as the greatest Briton of all time will tumble from that pedestal eventually. How many more generations will it take for enlightenment to come? I don't know. But every single point that I've made to you is an indisputable matter of historical record, can be verified by the contemporary newspapers. Every statement he's made, every claim he's uttered, every decision he's taken has been extensively minuted. I remember when Roy Jenkins wrote a rather flattering biography of Churchill and came to New York to launch it. I questioned him frankly. I said, what about some of these things, only a handful of these things? And he sort of looked slightly abashed and said, yes, I suppose he was a racialist. But the truth is that Churchill's admirers can only admire him by glossing over every single one of the things I've said to you. If you're going to convert this man into some sort of apostle of freedom and democracy, you have to overlook the overwhelming weight of evidence against that before 1940. That's the problem. And they do it. And they do it, of course, with beautiful, elegant prose and lots of pages of great admiration. But I've given you the reasons why I don't believe any of that is deserved.
Thank you so much, Shashi. I think it is important to remember that there is, like you quite rightly pointed out, that there is, as students and the younger generations learn the history of Britain with greater nuance and greater detail. I mean, forget nuance, actually learning the history in its detail is so important to start those conversations. The reasons why people were protesting at the statue was because there is a generation that asks questions of its own history. It's not the history of Britain, or it's not the history of India or the history of Hong Kong that is at stake. This is Britain's history that needs to be taught. And the whole discussion around statues, which of course bubbled over in this summer, this year, also raised very difficult questions about public art, who should be celebrated, who should be not. And I think somewhere there has been, if not a consensus, at least a very forceful opinion that has now found voice, that you cannot celebrate the lives of heroes without providing all the context, some detail of what this man's or woman, but there are very few statues of women anywhere in Britain, but what the statues, what this man actually stood for in its entirety, and therefore whether one should have a museum of colonialism, as some historians have argued for, where you can.
I have to myself.
Much more of a, and as you have, quite, to have a clear narrative. But what is fantastic is that whenever people want to inform themselves of Churchill in his entirety, they will always have your writings and books to turn to, amongst others. So thank you very much. This has been great fun, even though the subject matter has been less than. Thank you.
It's very bit painful. Well, thank you, Mukulika, for helping bring out all of these sordid realities of this anti-hero. But thank you very much, and all the best to the India in the Bay Festival at Hong Kong. Back to JLF. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tharoor and Dr. Banerjee, for that wonderful and, may I add, thought-provoking session. I, for one, didn't realize how that time flew by, and I'm convinced that the past hour did not have 60 minutes in it. A huge thank you to our viewers for tuning in, for the many social media posts, the shares, and the likes. Much appreciated. In case you missed out on any of our previous sessions on food, music, or wellness, you can still catch them on the Teamworks, Asia Society, or India by the Bay Facebook pages. We'll be back with you, hopefully, with an on-ground festival in 2021. We've got an exciting collaboration that we've been working on with Hong Kong Philharmonic. Till then, on behalf of my colleagues, Lakshmi, Paru, myself, and those at Teamwork Arts, stay safe and stay well.